Good afternoon to everyone, our presenters as well as our guests. I am Linda Caldwell Epps, one of the founding members of the Sankofa Collaborative. For those of you that do not know us, we are a group of several organizations, notably the William Trent House, the Stroudsburg Sauerland African American Museum, the New Jersey Historical Society, and my company, 1804 Consultants. We banded together in 2017 in response to our need to discover or to explore what other institutions across the state of New Jersey, to see how they were connected to their African American relatedness. And of course, the historic houses were included in that, but not just historic houses, other facilities as well, churches, cemeteries, all kinds of places. We started with holding one workshop in Trenton, one very cold and snowy Tuesday afternoon. And there was such an outcry that we hold such a session again, that we have done at least 2, sometimes as many as 4, in-person, all-day workshops since 2017. We count this as one of our workshops, one of our programs, although it is virtual. And like the rest of the world, we did pretty much go virtual for those years during the pandemic. Now we sort of do a hybrid. We do in-person as well as virtual. Some of you might have noticed that I did not mention the Grounds for Sculpture. They were one of our original partners. We have a different relationship with them now, but they are still part of us, but in a different way. So on behalf of the Sankofa Collaborative and all of the founding institutions, I welcome you to our program discussion about the most revered Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We will talk about his life in general, but more specifically, we'll talk about the impact that he might have had on our state of New Jersey. I remember very well April 4th, 1968, the day that he was assassinated. I'm going to tell my age. I was 17 at the time. And as much as there might be a generational gaps in our culture, in our society, I have found that one thing persists, and that is the overwhelming joy and happiness that people who turn 17 have, because it means that they can, as you may have already guessed, get a driver's license and have a car. Well, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on that April 4th. I had received my driver's license probably 2 or 3 days before that, and through the newspaper ads, found a car for sale that I could afford. My mother was supportive, but I think probably silently horrified. But it was when we went to the house of the man who had the car up for sale that we found out that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. We did not know the status of his condition at that point when we arrived there. But after we talked through the work of my purchasing the car, which was, by the way, a 1959 blue Ford Falcon, manual Ford Falcon, that he was selling for $50. I had $55, but told him if I gave him $50, he would have to keep the car for a couple of weeks for me, because I would then have to work until I raised money to get the car inspected and to get it registered. He said, please just take the car for $35. That's another whole story. But after we brokered the deal, he invited us into his home just to see on television what happened to Dr. King, whom we all know now died basically immediately after he was shot. He then invited us to stay. I am going somewhere with this. And we sat down and we watched a little of the news coverage of what was going on. He fed us some iced tea and coffee. And he admitted to my mother and I as we were leaving, he was Caucasian, he was European. And he said, I have lived on this block for about 40 years. There are 3, what he called colored families living on the block. And he said, I'm ashamed to say I have never invited them into my home. You are the first Negroes that have ever stepped foot in this house, as long as I have been living here. And he said, I guess I finally understand what Dr. King was talking about as of today, because as of today, I have changed as a person, as a human being. And now I understand a little bit more about all this race stuff and what has been going on across the country, or across the world, really. So that's a very simplistic story about Dr. King, but I think none of us can argue about the kind of impact that Dr. King and the millions that followed him had on not just the United States of America, but on the world. So now, more than several decades after his death, we still hold the date of his birth dear, and the date of his assassination, to commemorate his life and the love that he shared, his devotion to the equal rights of all human beings that he shared with, again, not just us, but with the world. And we have been forever changed. He left a legacy that is still very strong. So this afternoon, just to quickly understand how we will handle things, I'm the first part of it, and you've heard me for better or worse. I will now introduce Dr. Hettie Williams from Monmouth University, and she will give some remarks. I will then come back and introduce Dr. Chris Fisher from the College of New Jersey, and he will go on to introduce members of our panel, and then they will go forward and have what I know will be a very interesting and lively conversation. All right. So to Dr. Hettie Williams, for whom this is my first time meeting her, but I've heard so many things about her, and I already have in my mind something else I'm going to ask her to do. She has taught survey courses in U.S. history and Western civilization, and upper division courses on the history of African Americans for many years here. She is an associate professor of African American history in the Department of History and Anthropology at Monmouth University, located in West Long Branch, New Jersey. She has published many books and many chapters in books. It's a very long list of accomplishments that I could read to you. You will see, I know from her discussion, her brilliance will shine through. And if you are still interested after that, you can go online to read about her. And she also has a weekly podcast show with Monmouth University faculty titled This Week in Black History, Society, and Culture. She is the recipient of the Eugene Cinco Faculty Leadership Award, the PGIS Award in Social Justice, co-founder for the Monmouth University Race Conference, founder of the Works in Progress Seminar series, and nominated for the Distinguished Teaching Award in 2022. So on behalf of the Sankofa Collaborative and all of its many followers, Dr. Williams, I welcome you.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do today is just provide a little context to Martin Luther King's involvement or connection to New Jersey. And let me just see if I could do that. And I want to talk a little bit about how I frame the civil rights movement. After I talk about Martin Luther King's connection to New Jersey, and for about 10-15 minutes at the most. So this is an image of Martin Luther King when he came to Monmouth University in October of 1966. We actually have a recording of that on our website that I hope to play a little excerpt from it. If not, you can always go back to the website and listen to the 46-minute speech that he gave when he came to the university. And so, Martin Luther King, obviously, historians have come to embrace the notion of the long movement. Jacqueline Dowd Hall wrote a significant essay a few decades ago about the fact that the civil rights movement has a long history that exists outside of the Montgomery to Memphis narrative and begins before 1954. And so the long history of the civil rights movement is really what my work is all about. August Meyer and Elliot Rutwick wrote an article in 1967 about the freedom schools of East Orange, New Jersey. And that is at the turn of the century, as early as 1901, when Black parents took their students and began to teach them because they didn't want to send them to the segregated school system. And so that's a part of the long movement thesis of that there was a movement before 54. There were some of the earliest NAACP chapters appeared in New Jersey. And these were very active chapters that the NAACP took some notice of as a national organization because of how active these chapters, such as Montclair and Asbury Park, were, and also in the Oranges in Newark, New Jersey. School desegregation cases as early as 1927 are significant, in which local organizations sought help from NAACP lawyers to try and work to desegregate the schools. So it's a part of this long thesis narrative. The state convention of the NAACP in the 1930s. By the 1930s, the NAACP is referring to New Jersey as a special test case, a state among many that was a special state because of the activities around desegregation of the schools and public places. King visits the state several times in the 1950s and 1960s, which is well known. This is an image of King in Montclair, New Jersey in 1966 at the far bottom right of the screen from the Bergen Record in February 28, 2020. So you get this long movement that's happening before King arrives, but there's a reason why he's coming to the state by the 1950s and 1960s. There are stories about King and his association with the state in the 50s and the 60s that most of us on the call are probably really already aware of. The Maple Shade incident in 1950, and at 753 Walnut Street, where he likely stayed when he was a seminary student at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. Mary's Cafe here on the left, which doesn't exist anymore, is likely where he staged his first nonviolent direct action activity when he and some friends sought to buy a drink and were told that they were not allowed to, they should leave. And they sat down and refused to leave. When the owner of the cafe came with a gun, they decided to leave and go file a police report. And so some of this has been written about, obviously, in several New Jersey publications. This is an image from the New Jersey Monthly to the right. So that incident takes place in 1950. King likely stayed at 753 Walnut Street occasionally. So King had a direct connection, obviously, with the state for many reasons prior to the height of the movement, after he gets involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, and so on. He visited several portions of the state, several areas of the state through the 60s as well. And this is an image on the right from the Bergen Record as well, where Martin Luther King Jr. is waiting to speak at Montclair High School. He's sitting in the band room while he waits to be called to speak. So he had a mentor at Drew University that he would come and visit and speak to from time to time. He also spoke at Drew University, and in the same year that he visited Montclair High School is the same year that he also spoke at Monmouth University. I'll play a clip from that if I have a time, but if I don't have time, I'm not going to worry about it. You can go listen to it. So why did King come to the state so many times in the 50s and the 60s? New Jersey, as we all know, had one of the largest Black populations in the colonial era, and it had a large number of African Americans coming in the state during the Great Migration. And so there was an infrastructure put in place in the state of New Jersey prior to the 1950s when King arrives. So there was an infrastructure, there was a Black elite community that had ties to the state. It's why so many people come to the state during the Great Migration as well, because of those ties and connections and that infrastructure that was there through organizations like the NAACP, the Montclair YWCA, and so on. So the struggle for Black equality is ongoing. And so scholars who look at the civil rights movement consider the struggle for Black equality to exist outside of the parameters of 54 and 58. It exists outside of King's own activism. Two books that discuss that are to the left, Harvard Sitcos, The Struggle for Black Equality, and Charles Payne's I've Got the Light of Freedom, in which he talks about local people who are organizing before 54. Many scholars have also spoke about Black women and the movement, and this is really what my work is focused on, the role of Black women in the movement. 1999, China Kai Lee's book, Freedom's Sake, about Fannie Lou Hamer. Keisha Blaine's recent book about Fannie Lou Hamer situates women at the center of the movement. Danielle McGuire's book in 2010 is talking about the Women's Political Council in Montgomery in the 1940s. And she's talking about what's happening in Montgomery before King is born and what women are doing on the ground, organizing a movement that exists before King becomes active directly in the movement in the 1950s. And so this has led scholars to talk about the Deep North and the fact that there was a civil rights movement in the North, there was a civil rights movement in places like New Jersey, and because King's family has long ties to the NAACP, he was clearly aware of a movement that was happening already in New Jersey before he arrived. So he had a reason to connect and come to New Jersey, where I argue the movement began. And so the movement involves women, as I just stated, and it involves many women in the North. So my book, The Georgia of the North, discusses the role of Black women in New Jersey. Betty Adams' book talks about the long movement of Black women in churches in New Jersey. I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to skip a little bit. And so women like Sarah Spencer Washington in Atlantic City is one individual I talk about. She's connected to various organizations in the state, helping to fight against segregation. She's known for being a businesswoman, but she also had a vested interest in supporting the civil rights movement. More well-known women in New Jersey, Marianne Thompson Wright's work becomes significant. She's a historian and sociologist who is helping to collect data on segregation in the state. And so New Jersey becomes a center of desegregation in the public school system. And Wright plays a direct role in that by doing historical research for litigation in the Brown case. How does she get that position? because a significant case in 1944, Hedgepeth Williams versus the Trenton Board of Education, rises to the level of the state Supreme Court in New Jersey. And so even in that case, you have Marion Thompson Wright, a woman who's doing historical research for litigation, and you have the mothers of the two children who were denied access to going to a middle school that was closer to their house. They were forced to go to a middle school that was relegated for African Americans in Trenton. They go to Robert Queen, who's sitting here, lawyer for the NAACP, and they say, we want you to fight this case. This case ends up before the New Jersey Supreme Court, and the decision is decided that the school was breaking the law and they must end the practices of separating students by race. This is just an image of the Hedgepeth Williams school. So in other words, the civil rights movement is happening in New Jersey far before 1954 when King arrives, but King is aware of this. It's why he comes to New Jersey, because he knew what was happening here and the infrastructure that was put in place. He also has many ties to individuals at different educational institutions in the state that he came to confer with. New Jersey, he was aware, was ahead of the times in many ways, because it's in 1947, New Jersey gets a new state constitution that says you have to end segregation in the public school system, the state National Guard, and in public places. That becomes the blueprint for ending segregation in the nation. So King is aware of all of these things. And it's why I argue you have this long movement that begins in New Jersey that King was very much aware of. And it's why he kept and maintained ties to the state. This is just an image of the New Jersey Civil Rights Act of 1949 from New Jersey Afro-American. So that just, I hope, provides everybody with a little bit of context as to King's ties to the state, the longer movement that was happening before King, and what he also recognized in terms of having these connections to the state as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams, for setting a tone for us and getting us on our path to the broader discussion with our panel, who will be moderated by Dr. Christopher Fisher, who is an associate professor of history at the College of New Jersey in Ewing. Some of us know it as Trenton State. He teaches U.S. history in the late 20th century and has served in various administrative capacities that include department chair of African American Studies, provost, search chair, and co-chair of the President's Commission on Race and Educational Attainment. Dr. Fisher earned his bachelor's degree in history and political science from Rutgers College in 1993 and a PhD in history from Rutgers University in 2001. He's co-authored a textbook, Global America in the 20th Century, and has published in Pacific Historical Review, International History Review, and several other publications, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Star Ledger, and other venues. He is co-editor with Dr. Lucia McMahon at William Patterson University and Rutgers Studies in History, a new book series published by Rutgers University Press. Met Dr. Fisher a few years ago where we served on a panel together. I don't know if you remember, and that was at Kane University. Good to see you. Thank you for saying yes to our call, and it's all on you now.
Thank you, Dr. Epps. I got to tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, and also to hear and be taught by Dr. Williams. I am a fan, like everyone else. I know of her history, so it is wonderful to have that experience and to gain her knowledge. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to introduce the three speakers. I'll introduce them all at one time. And then what I'll do is sort of open the floor for them to give some comments. And then I'll ask them a few questions and we'll go for a while. And then after that, I'll open it up for whatever questions we get in the chat box. So the first person that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Jean-Pierre Brutus, who holds a PhD and JD in African American, PhD in African American Studies, sorry, and a JD from Northwestern University. He is senior counsel in the Economic Justice Program at the Institute for Social Justice located in Newark. He has a long history of advocating for citizens' rights in both New York and New Jersey, and is currently leading that institute's advocacy for reparations. Our second speaker is the Reverend Dr. Charles F. Boyer. Reverend Boyer is the pastor at the Greater Mount Zion AME Church in Trenton, located not too far from TC&J, and is the co-founder of Salvation and Social Justice, which advocates for public policy rooted in the Black faith and its traditions. Reverend Boyer, who is rooted in the Black religious tradition of ministry to the public, especially through the lens of liberation theology, is a staunch advocate for social justice issues that range from challenging and reforming New Jersey's criminal justice system to policing to drug prosecutions, but he doesn't just stop there. He also advocates for refugees. He advocates locally for feeding families in Trenton, and he's also working to end gun violence. The next speaker will be Mr. Larry Hamm, who has an incredible history, and who is actually featured, I think, today in the New Jersey Monitor. Mr. Hamm is the chairperson of the People's Organization for Progress, a Newark-based group, and a longtime advocate for the vulnerable and the oppressed in New Jersey. He founded the People's Organization for Progress in 1982 after an activist career that actually stretched back to his youth, beginning, I think, in 1972, where he served as the 71, thank you, 71, where he served as the youngest delegate to the Black Power Conference in Gary, Indiana, from Newark. Did I get that right? Thank you, thank you, thank you. The People's Organization for Progress is truly diverse and inclusive. And it is aimed at challenging social, economic, and racial injustice. As recently as 2021, he led a march against police brutality from Newark to Trenton. And even more recently, he put his hat in the political ring as a candidate for Senator Bob Menendez's seat. We have a diverse, accomplished, and fascinating panel of speakers. So I just want to give them a few minutes each to talk about how their life's work intersects, builds upon, or cuts against Dr. King's approach and legacy. So if we could start with Dr. Brutus and then work our way to the Reverend and to Mr. Hamm, that would be great. Dr. Brutus, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fisher, and good afternoon, everyone. I do want to say, first of all, thank you so much to Linda Caldwell Epps and the Sankofa Collaborative for having me this afternoon. It's really an honor to be on this panel with my fellow panelists to discuss Dr. King's legacy. So it's an honor to be here. And I will keep my comments brief because I do want to get to the questions that you have for us, Dr. Fisher, as a moderator, and then also to the Q&A. But what I will say is that whenever I have the opportunity to reflect on and to commemorate and honor Dr. King's legacy, I always want to point to what folks call the radical king, who I think is always the same king, right? It's one and the same. But what has happened, as folks have pointed out, is that the memory of King has been sort of whitewashed and the Santa Fe classification of King, right? His vision has been circumscribed. And so when thinking about King, I always want to draw from the king who was an independent thinker, an independent activist, one who was willing to stand apart from some of the, mainstream thinking of the time. And so a lot of folks would tell King to stay in his lane around civil rights and would impose upon him that, his work was really limited to a particular moment in the South, as opposed to thinking about issues on a global level, on a national level, linking together racism, militarism, and capitalism, right? So King had this grand vision. And partly he had that grand vision, that belief, that principled stance allowed for an independence that was not, he didn't capitulate to any political party. He was willing to break away from some of the mainstream or middle class aspirants within the Black community, right? He was able to call out, you know, white allies who were pushing for moderate approaches, right? And King was not popular in the time that he lived, right? We have this idea that King was always popular, but he took controversial positions, including his stance criticizing the Vietnam War. He could work with LBJ to get civil rights passed, but he also could be critical of LBJ for his stances internationally and in foreign policy. And I think that's incredibly important to think about when we are doing our work about taking bold, radical stances that are principled, that are independent. And King was also an intellectual. He could bring his ideas and articulate them in a way that broader public could understand. So in his sermons, he would bring up philosophers, theologians, right? And he was unapologetic and unafraid about doing that, but making it accessible for his parishioners to understand, right? And so he was deeply committed to the work, right? He put himself into it. And so that's what I want to think about when I think about King, the radical King, the King who had an economic critique, who connected his racial critique with his economic critique to the foreign policy critique. You have to remember, when King was in Memphis, he was organizing strikers who were workers in transportation as well as other kinds of workers, right? He went to Chicago, right, in what folks would call the slums of Chicago in the South Side, organizing around issues of housing, right? So he had this expansive vision. So I think we need to really remember that when we're thinking about King and not limit King to a particularly kind of, glossy, pristine, short period of time. And so that's what I think about when I think about Dr. King.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, thank you to the Sankofa Collective for inviting me again to my fellow panelists, both of whom I have great admiration for. And so, yeah, thank you for this discussion. This is good stuff. When I think about King, I mean, he really is an apostle in my mind in many ways when we're thinking about the Black faith tradition. He coming from a long line of the Black faith tradition, which I link all the way back to Richard Allen, who was the founder of African Methodism. And I think King would highlight that himself. But thinking about King and how he used theology, Black faith-rooted theology, which he was very much guided by and built on the thought of Howard Thurman, right? And so how King actually took theology and the Black faith tradition to liberate public policy. And that's really how I look to, as a faith leader in this tradition, to tap into that. I would also say that looking at the Black faith journey from slavery and looking at things like Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail should be part of the Black canon. It is really an apostolic epistle, which is absolutely on par from a sacred standpoint from the Black faith tradition, and even in the American faith tradition should be on par with the Apostle Paul. So I want to say that with all of that and the reverence for King, at the same time, I think that the critique of King's work is right, like the illusion of inclusion and integration itself. We were really lulled to sleep by the false promises of equity that never actually touched the masses, right? So those of us from the affirmative action, civil rights class of Black folks, we lost something very important in the inferno of integration. Dr. King himself, towards the end of his life, right, said, I've come to believe we're integrated into a burning house. Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And so there's this urging in my mind for us to develop our own institutions and systems. We lost a lot in integration. We lost Black educators. We lost independent Black schools. We lost Black business. We lost Black doctors, Black insurance companies, banks, food networks, collective economics, property, wealth. We lost collective consciousness, shared values, self-reliance, mutual support. We lost a sense of Black excellence. We lost high standards and keeping each other accountable. We outsourced teaching our history to a system that hated us. And we're dealing with all of that now. We entrusted our housing needs to a system that feeds off our misery. We allowed the Black church, the Divine Nine, the NAACP, largely to become social clubs rather than the very engines of communal Black infrastructure, which we need to support. So and here in New Jersey, right, integration led to the dismantling of the Bordentown School, which ultimately becomes a prison for youth, for primarily Black youth. So I'm in no way arguing against integration, but what I am saying that the benefits have been exhausted. And the singular focus on integration at the detriment of building Black infrastructure has proven to be a major flaw in the civil rights movement. And so what I would say in terms of where we pivot to at this stage, and given everything that we've seen in recent history, how the nation has moved backwards and we are caught utterly off guard and ill-prepared. So we need to really go back to Black-led, community-led solutions, public safety, Black birth and infrastructure, Black education, and Black economics. I think that's where we are now. And I think King himself would implore us to begin to think in those kinds of terms.
Should I go now? I want to thank the Sankofa Collective for inviting me on, and Sister Caldwell Epps, thank you for your opening remarks, and Dr. Hettie Williams. I learned today from you some things I didn't know in that short presentation you made, but very informative. And to my comrades, Jean-Pierre and Dr. Boyer, it's good to see you once again. My first connection to Dr. King was probably when I was around, I guess, 10 years old. I lived in an apartment. After my father passed away, my mother went back to live with her parents. My grandparents took me with her. And so I had my grandmother and grandfather, my grandmother's sister, my Aunt Joan, lived with us. And she was a live-in domestic. She worked for a white family during the week. She stayed there, and then she came home on the weekends. And I guess at some point she told the family that she worked for, that she had a nephew and so on and so forth. And so they used to send things, used things, through her to me. And sometimes it was records. I was probably the only kid in the Central Ward of Newark on South 12th Street that had albums by composers like Debussy and Dvorak and so on and so forth. But one day, my Aunt Joan brought home this album. Now, this is not the original, but this is actually the same picture that was on the original copy. But this is the album. It was a record of one of Dr. King's speeches in the struggle for freedom and human dignity. And it was a speech. It was a speech that was recorded. It was the speech he gave at the New York Armory when he returned home from receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, which I believe was in, Dr. Boyer, help me if I'm wrong here, I believe it might have been 1964 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, I didn't come from a politically active family. I don't even know if my folks belong to the NAACP. My mother was a seamstress. She worked in the cleaners around the corner on 16th Avenue. My grandfather was what's called a boiler man. He kept the furnaces running in a big factory that actually made cardboard. It's kind of early version of recycling. They would take old paper and make it into cardboard. And I don't remember a lot of political discussions in my house, but my Aunt Joan gave me this record and I was curious, so I put it on my little portable fold-out record player and I started listening to it. And I swear, I never heard a man talk like that before. Now, I wasn't like some of you, I was not raised in the church. I did go to church occasionally, but I was not like a kid that was, in church every Sunday. And when I did go to church, it was usually Sunday school. I had never heard anybody talk like Dr. King talked. And I'm gonna tell you, at the time, it sounded to me like the voice of God. That's how it sounded to me, a little kid in the Central Ward of Newark. I mean, I had never been to any political rallies, conventions, or anything else, but I was probably in the 5th or 6th grade when I heard this, and I was profoundly affected by it. That speech, I had never heard the "I Have a Dream" speech. I don't even know if they had recorded and distributed recordings of "I Have a Dream" by 1964. But that speech, the struggle for freedom and human dignity, that was the first Dr. King speech I ever heard. And I think I heard it, it had to be around like 1965, and when my Aunt Joan brought home this record. And in that speech, Dr. King was moving along, ideologically. He didn't just talk about civil rights in that speech. He talked about the struggle, the war on poverty. He talked about the struggle for the redistribution of wealth, the elimination of poverty, and so on and so forth. Now, these are ideas that, I had never heard before. And to be truthful, at that age, I may not have understand everything. It was how he said it that got to me. I understood what poverty was. I understood what being poor was. And I understood what being hungry was. There's one part in that speech, he says, we had a surplus in wheat production or corn production. And the question was, what should we do with that surplus? And Dr. King said, we can put it in the bellies of the children that go to bed hungry at night. I never forgot that. I never forgot that. And that was before he was assassinated. The second thing is, with regard, thinking along the same lines as Sister Epps, When I think back on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, what strikes me is how different the reaction was from the assassination of John Kennedy. I was in elementary school when President Kennedy was assassinated. Schools were let out early. And when we returned to school, there was an assembly program to talk about the assassination of President Kennedy. And I'm sure all of us who are old enough to remember that remember exactly where we were. And in a way, time sort of stood still. When Dr. King was assassinated, there was nothing. I was a student at Arts High School. I was in my freshman year. I was in the spring cycle of my freshman year at Arts High School. When Dr. King was assassinated, it was never mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in our social studies class. There was no assembly. You know how they give announcements over the intercom system in the morning. There was nothing said in the morning. To this day, now as a freshman, to this day, I have no memory of anything being said about the assassination of Martin Luther King the entire 4 years. I'm talking about through, official line, like by my teachers or by administrators. By the time I graduated in 1971. Our brother Fisher mentioned that I was appointed to the Board of Education at the age of 17 as a result of a student movement we had. We walked out in March 1971. We sat in at what today is called the Doubletree Hotel across the street from Penn Station. At that time, it was called the Gateway Hotel. 400 of us walked out of Arts High. We marched down to the Gateway. 200 of us got in. We sat in there. Act of civil disobedience. Mayor Gibson showed up. And as a result of that meeting, 2 months later, just before I graduated from Arts High School at the age of 17, he asked me if I would be willing to be a member of the Newark Board of Education, not a student rep, but a full voting board member. And I was sworn in on July 1st, 1971. I wasn't even old enough to vote. Now, the amendment that gave 18-year-olds the right to vote had just been passed. I wasn't even old enough to vote. And there I was sitting on the Board of Education. As a result of being appointed to the board, I received a letter in the mail from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in August of 1971. And they were inviting me to come to the SCLC convention in New Orleans in August of 1971. And I went down there, and at that time, I received the Southern Christian Leadership Conference Youth Leadership Award. I received that award from the hands of Coretta Scott King. And while I was down there, I not only met Coretta Scott King, I met Ralph Abernathy, I met Andrew Young, I met Jesse Jackson, I met Hosea Williams. And did I say I met Andrew Young? And I met Rosa Parks in person. And when I returned from the convention, I put forward a resolution as a school board member to change the name of Waverly Avenue School to Rosa Parks Elementary School, which passed. But Reverend Boyer, the school, the roof collapsed. The school was over 100 years old. The roof collapsed. So Rosa Parks School don't exist anymore. But it was one of the first schools that were renamed after Black people. You know, when we were on the board, we changed the name of several schools. Robert Treat became Marcus Garvey. South 10th became Harry Tubman. South 8th became Martin Luther King. Southside High School became Malcolm X Shabazz. And then later on, you know, I was not in the civil rights movement. I came to political consciousness in the Black Power movement under the guidance of Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka had a profound impact on my political consciousness. I did not meet Dr. King in person. I did not meet Malcolm X, but I was introduced to their ideas through Amiri Baraka. And Amiri Baraka had a bookstore next to his headquarters, which was at 502 then High Street, now Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. He had a bookstore called Nayumba Ya Ujamaa. And it was at Nayumba Ya Ujamaa that I bought my first book that was written by Dr. King. Not this one. This is more recent. The other one fell apart. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And when my school board term was up in 1974, I had a lot of questions about the movement, because the Black Power movement, in its early stages, was really about Black people having control over the institutions in our communities. And it was a kind of a basic premise that if we controlled the institutions of our community, we could change our condition. And by 1974, I was beginning to see the limitations on this strategy. So in the summer of 1974, I was 20 years old. I began to do a lot of reading. And I read Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. I read a lot of other books, but my reading of Where Do We Go From Here really opened my eyes to what Jean-Pierre, Dr. Brutus said earlier, the radical Dr. King. Because the Dr. King that our children are taught about and the Dr. King that's touted by the media is not the real Martin Luther King. You want to get down with the real Dr. King, you got to read the stuff he wrote. Really, I would say from probably around 1964, because Dr. King wrote 6 books: Measure of a Man, Stride Toward Freedom, Strength to Love, Why We Can't Wait, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and Trumpet of Conscience. You can begin to see the shift, the strategic shift in his thinking in why we can't wait, because it's in Why We Can't Wait that Dr. King first puts forward his what he called a Bill of Rights for the socially disadvantaged. In my 1968, he was calling it the Economic Bill of Rights. And by the time I went back to Princeton in 1974, I had been there in 1971, but I left to do my term on the school board, came back. I wrote an article for the Daily Princetonian called "The King We Do Not Know." And that kind of grounded me. But, that's just an overview of some of the interconnections with the King and myself. And this Saturday, we marching for Dr. King in Newark. We want everybody to come out. The Martin Luther King March of Resistance, Saturday, January 18th, 12 noon at the Martin Luther King statue, 495 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Newark.
Thank you, Mr. Hamm. Well, we have a lot to choose from here. Thank you to each of the speakers. I think it's a marvelous place for us to start. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is I'm going to sort of take some of those questions that I sent you, and I'm going to cobble a couple of them together because I think you've all been sort of addressing them in your own way. And one of the themes that seems to be coming out of each of your presentation of Dr. King is that we need to see the multidimensional King, right? And in particular, we need to think about King in his own intellectual, social evolution over time. So my question to you is really thinking about if we were to take King at the beginning of his journey, right? So we're talking about, we can go back to when Dr. Williams highlighted his activism. But if we want to even go with the more popular depiction of King's politicization, right, which is around 1955, and we couple that moment at which he subscribes to nonviolent direct action with the King who by the end of his life is really advocating for an economic Bill of Rights, how do both of those sort of ends of his spectrum in his development relate to people in New Jersey today and the questions that they have to address in order to achieve social justice and equity. So please feel free to answer any way you want. What can resonate with people today? Because I heard a couple of themes that I find really interesting. One of which is, the way we celebrate civil rights and the whole idea of nonviolent direct action, which is, sort of coupled with the idea of integration, but also where it broke down, right? So if we sort of use those two moments, what should we as New Jerseyans claim as a way of understanding King so that he's relevant to our problems today?
I guess I'll go first, and I'll take a crack at it first, and then I'll pass it over to my fellow panelists. What I will say is, and thank you for that question, and I will touch on some of what Reverend Boyer and Larry Hamm pointed out are, when you talk about the civil rights movement, I think sometimes there's this idea that the civil rights movement failed and the Reconstruction failed, right? And that's the framing. And I would say that rather than think of them as failing, I would say that there was a concerted backlash to attack the gains made by the civil rights movement, right? And we are living in the wake of that backlash, right? That's one. Two, part of where we see Black people today in terms of all the racial inequalities, right? Mass incarceration is part of the backlash to the civil rights movement. The continued racial wealth gap, right? We see these economic inequalities across all these different statistics that the Institute in New Jersey has been publishing. And I think one of the things that folks have been pointed out, in particular the historian Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor in her work Race for Profit, calls the inclusion of Black people in public life today predatory inclusion, right? They are subject to predation, right? To being exploited, right? The condition of them being part of public life through all these various means is to continue to be exploited in different kinds of ways. And I don't think that's necessarily a limitation of the civil rights movement as much as it is the reorganization of white supremacy by other means, right? And so we need to think about King's actions and his thought around his expansion and the evolution of his thought to including an economic Bill of Rights, the critique of militarism, his willingness to engage and support those who are striking as a set of tactics that we can utilize to think expansively of what is needed now. And I don't think necessarily that King was, limited to civil rights in his thinking, as Brother Hamm has pointed out, because he had a vision for Black freedom, right? And we need to continue to think in a future-oriented kind of sense, as King was thinking, and constantly developing our thought. And King was willing to do that, right? He was willing to expand his thinking, willing to engage in different kinds of practices. And I think we need to think about that kind of forward-looking, propulsive aspect of King's thought and action. His willingness to go from the king of the Montgomery bus boycott in 55 to the king in Memphis in 68, right? And so we can also, learn from that in our own kinds of movement in New Jersey as we begin to think about, particularly in this moment when we see this backlash against affirmative action, against critical race theory, against racial justice, and essentially against multiracial democracy.
Yeah, I'll lean in a little bit, and I appreciate Jean-Pierre, because I see that as profoundly relevant, and I couldn't agree more. I think I'll lean in on the nonviolent direct action part of that, and why. And I think you have like the integration focus, which is often the focus that I have a dream, let's all run down the street together version of King that we have all critiqued here, right? As opposed to the more authentic King with the really seeing the limitations of America and what that means for Black folks, and the necessity to have a really radical vision for economics and economic equity and what that all looks like. But there does need to be a decoupling of nonviolent direct action with the kumbaya integrationist version. So the what I do think was the brilliance of King, which remains extremely relevant New Jersey and beyond, is the moral weight and power of nonviolent direct action and what that meant. King King was a prophet, but King was also a great statesman, right? And he utilized that power alongside nonviolent direct action to not use the oppressor's tools to dismantle oppression. And so he carried with him the prophetic, divine nature, in a sense, in that the critique of militarism and violence in which America was founded made Dr. King, and I'm a huge lover and student of the Black Power movement, but I think and it's so profoundly taken out of context as well, right? But I think the power of King is that King never raised the gun. And so just from someone who comes from the Black faith tradition, right, this is also rooted in a Jesus ethic that says you dismantle the oppressive thing by ultimately using nonviolent means to do it, because violence is a consistent cycle that feeds upon itself. You will never get to peace, equity, all these different things. It will never end in, and that's the brilliance, I think, the power and the divine weight that King brings to this. So being a student of that, and I just have to say, what's really interesting is that King ultimately learns more about Jesus from from Mahatma Gandhi, than he does from Christians. So, and that powerful quote, I love the Christian, I love the Christ, I just don't love the Christians, right? And so, because they're the biggest hypocrites. So that's the power in which King, and so for all of us, and I can say for my co-panelists, as we have fought this in New Jersey, right? We don't do it by blowing up the state house, right? We do it by in the power of the Black faith tradition, using the moral clarion calls towards justice, mobilizing people, doing what's right. Because what happens is that in a system that is inherently violent towards Black people, when we respond in this divine, nonviolent way, when the response is violent, all you can hear is the echoes of the moral bankruptcy of the system. And that is what forces the change, because it forces the system to look at itself in its gruesome demonic nature and how it treats people. And so using that as a means, which I think is the biggest lesson from King, and King being there's no one who can take away the fact that King, even though I think we have to say, and I think this is the power of Dr. Williams' work, we always have to say, right, King is the benefactor of generations of Black women doing this before him, and he just happens to be in the right place at the right time and now becomes the spokesperson. So we have to acknowledge that. But with that being said, the continuum of that nonviolent direct action, which culminates in King as a spokesperson, is the absolute, probably most powerful, consequential figure to change the trajectory of the United States, period. Outside of that, right, because slavery ultimately had to come by ultimately white folks killing each other. I mean, black folks get involved. Well, I'm going up, but you get my point. You get my point.
Oh, man. Excellent. Excellent response. Brother Hamm.
Yes. So much has been said, not here, but in other places, has been said about the evolution of Martin Luther King, about the evolution of his thinking. But having read a lot of what Dr. King has written and said, not only in the 6 books I mentioned, but also there's another book I would recommend to people, A Testament of Hope, edited by Dr. James Washington. It's a heavy tome, but I like it because about 1/3 of that book is speeches, articles, sermons, interviews with Dr. King in the last year of his life. Dr. King gave that speech. We call it Why I Oppose the War in Vietnam. The formal name of the speech, I believe, was A Time to Break the Silence, because Dr. King had recognized that he had been purposefully silent on the issue of Vietnam when many of the people around him, including his wife, had come out against the war before he did. I mean, as early as 1963, SNCC came out against the war in Vietnam. John Lewis spoke, he was the youth speaker on the platform at the March on Washington in 63, but they edited his speech. He could not talk. His original speech was to discuss Vietnam, and they edited the part. And you can actually go online and see the part of John Lewis's speech that they took out. So there was this pressure coming from Dr. King's left, coming from SNCC, coming from Stokely Carmichael, then Stokely Carmichael, who later became Kwame Ture, to speak out on Vietnam. And finally, he gives that speech at Riverside Church on April the 4th, 1967. He is assassinated a year to the day, April the 4th, 1968. Now, on the question of evolution, yes, did Dr. King evolve? Absolutely. We all evolve, right? We wouldn't go to what we said at 17 as an exemplar of what we're saying at 71. But there's also a lot of consistency. See, I used to be of the school, because originally I was a Malcolm man. I came up in the Black Power movement. No, it was Malcolm, not Dr. King. But then when I started reading Dr. King, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. In fact, in the summer that I did this reading, the summer of 1974, I read Malcolm X Speaks and I read Where Do We Go From Here? And I would write in the margins of the page, I would write, in Dr. King's book, I would write, is this Dr. King or is this Malcolm X? And then I would read Malcolm X and then I would write, is this Malcolm X or is this Dr. King? Because Malcolm evolved in the same way. If you read Malcolm X Speaks and you read the speeches that Malcolm gave at the Audubon, as a matter of fact, at the speech he gave at the Audubon when he had Fannie Lou Hamer as his guest, he talks about that speech that Dr. King gave at the Armory in New York, this one. He talks about that speech because Dr. King never said the word socialism. When Dr. King, he said, when I went to Oslo, I didn't see any people sleeping on the street at night. I didn't see hungry children. He was talking about the nature of, the Scandinavian countries, their social democratic economic system. And Malcolm X was critiquing him. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, there's both evolution, but there's also consistency. If you read Stride Toward Freedom, which is Dr. King's account of the Montgomery bus boycott. Because remember, there are many accounts, many books have been written about Montgomery, by participants, by organizers. So Dr. King is but one account of Montgomery. But he says some pretty radical stuff in Stride Toward Freedom. You know, he says some pretty, and I began to see, yes, evolution, but I also see consistency. In recent years, in recent years, authors had brought to light letters between Dr. King and Coretta, even before they were married, where Dr. King says, as early as 1953, you know, he's saying, well, I lean more towards socialism. You know, he says this in the letter to Coretta. And then there's a speech, then it wasn't a speech, but there was a meeting, a staff meeting, where he did speak. And he also indicated that he, you know, leaned toward democratic socialism. That's pretty radical. I mean, consider that the Montgomery bus boycott was right during the McCarthy era. And they were always accused. Just the other night, I was at a program where somebody stood up and said, some people try to say Dr. King was a communist, but he was a red-blooded American. Well, that kind of obfuscates things, you know, because he did have socialistic views on, I mean, here, and where do we go from here? Chaos or community? He says here in chapter 6, the World House, he says we need a radical redistribution of power and wealth in this country. That's a quote. And he goes on to say we need a, quote, radical transformation of our socioeconomic system. See, this is the King that people don't want to talk about. They only want to talk about, I have a dream. They only want to talk about, you know, primarily the struggle against apartheid. And you know, I think the struggle against apartheid, because that's what it was. South Africa learned it from the United States. Hitler sent a delegation of Nazi Party members. This is real. Sent a delegation of Nazi Party members to the United States to examine the system of racial segregation in the United States. The delegation came back to Hitler and said, that's too radical for us. You know, this is the mother of apartheid. So, you know, the civil rights movement's great accomplishment was the abolition of legal apartheid. There were laws on the books. I mean, why do you think there was a great migration? Was it simply because people were seeking a better economic existence? It was also because Black people were living under racial terror in the South. And a lot of people was like, I can't live here. I'll get killed if I stay here. You know, so I think Dr. King, you know, he was a man of his time. He was someone who was trying to synthesize theory and practice. I mean, if Dr. King had started the Montgomery bus boycott talking about socialism, he wouldn't have got nowhere. People would have left. They wouldn't even stayed at the church. They'd have left. You know, he had to deal with what people could, as much as people could take at that time. And then when he gets to the 60s, when he says clearly, you know, what difference does it make if I can sit at a lunch counter and buy the hamburger, but don't have enough money to afford the hamburger? So
Indeed.
He's starting to deal with the economic issue.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much. So we only have 15 minutes left, but I want to make sure that we open it up to the public. And my hope is that Dr. Williams and Linda will jump in and offer some words for us as well. So any questions from the audience? And in the meantime, if Dr. Williams wants to jump in and talk about King and the intellectual traditions that you study, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, great comments from the panelists about continuity in King's thinking, but also change. And I was, you know, George Kelsey was his mentor at Drew, who was a theologian who taught him at Morehouse, and it's George Kelsey who sort of, shaped his thinking on race and religion. So I think that right there is a part of the continuity of King, because King comes to New Jersey in '66 to see George Kelsey, who's teaching at Drew at the time. He always would go back to his mentor, consistently. And Kelsey even looked at, I think, a draft of Stride Toward Freedom at one point. But he's certainly in the Black radical tradition. Nonviolent direct action it's a radical idea that's asking you to lean in, and he's a part of that whole intellectual tradition. uh the continuity, I think, in his thinking is love, right? That runs through all of his thinking from the beginning to the end. And in Strength to Love, he's saying what I'm asking you to do is not easy. Hate is easy. It's easy to say, that person looks different from me, so I hate them. And he takes Nietzsche's idea, the German philosopher's idea of love, will to power, and he turns it on its head, and he says, love, power without love is reckless and abusive. So even in leadership, you must, right, embrace this conceptualization of love. That's the continuity that I see. He gets angry, and he says, one of his last speeches was Black Power, that he writes in Testament of Hope. Black Power appears in there. And so but he was human, right? It's hard to love and not expect anything in return. And I think that's the continuity piece, but part of the larger Black intellectual tradition. Clearly, I think one of your questions, Dr. Fisher, was about who holds that legacy today. I tie it back to Drew University and William Barber, who was also educated at Drew, and the beloved community, which Barber is talking about, and using and leaning in to nonviolent direct action.
I do want to, hopefully you were finished, Dr. Williams?
Yes.
Okay. We've been through a hell of a year here. And probably about 18 months before the election, I heard Sherilyn Ifill give a talk at the New York Public Library, and where she basically laid out exactly what happened this past November with the election. And her talk at that point was a warning. Look, this is where we're headed, and we need to be having discussions about how we can prevent this, right? Well, we didn't have too many discussions that I'm aware of. And hence we are where we are today, and we're about to inaugurate someone in just a few days that, anyway. But my question is, and I think I heard Dr. Williams allude to this, where are we today? Where is the leadership today? I can think back to the 60s and the 70s, and I can give you names of people that were visibly out there in the struggle, advising, encouraging, embracing some of the ideas that all of you have put forth this afternoon, which I know that I'm prejudiced. I'm part of this organization. I think all of you gave absolutely excellent remarks, and I'm so happy that you were with us. But where are we today? And what do we do about getting on track where we have our young people and our old people like me have a voice, a national voice that can give us advice, can demonstrate what we should be doing, so that this world that King and others in our past have put up there as an example of who we should be can work towards getting there. So either my question wasn't clear, or you all don't know either. Okay.
Well, if we could, does anyone have a direct response to that? And then I'd like to go to a couple of people who put in questions.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I'll jump in briefly on that. I think one of the things that we need to think about is what are our understandings of leadership, because sometimes we look to King, we look to certain figures as in the individual charisma, right? And we put them on a pedestal in some ways, and we forget their humanity, and we forget.
And Eddie Glaude's book has warned us against that. So you're right.
Yeah. So, and I think we should rethink our understandings of what leadership means, re-understand thinking, and also look to our local leaders, our state leaders, right? And there are many different kinds of leadership, and for many different, and we need new models of leadership. And even at Dr. King's time, right, there are many, many, many different kinds of leaders who were unsung, who did not get the spotlight that King had, right? And when you read the recent biography about King, Jonathan Ives' books, A Life, you see how human King is, right? Right, his doubts, his fears, right? How overwhelmed and exhausted he was, right? And so you think about when we put so much on one person, right? How that can have an effect on, and so folks have been talking about this recently. We're in a different moment, and we need different kinds of leadership and multiple kinds of leadership.
Yeah, if I could, I'd like to go to a couple of people because we are running short on time. One, I'd love to give the floor to Shay. Did I get that right?
Yes, you did. Excuse me. Yes, you did.
Please feel free to ask your question.
Oh, thank you. Aligning with the State Amistad Commission, how can all of this scholarship and analysis, meaning all of the panelists, how can all of this scholarship be juxtaposed to our current school districts and curriculum? That's the question.
Well, I'll take a quick stab. Here in New Jersey with the Amistad, I mean, we obviously it's going to take a lot of local organizing because the way that New Jersey's school districts, they're so segregated. So it becomes very hard to give any kind of unified curriculum, which means that it needs to be very much almost a hyper localized piece. But the thing that I do want to add to this, I am one who thinks that we are delusional in the fact that we have outsourced the teaching of our history to a public school system, right? I'm not saying that we should not fight that, but when the Jews were free from Egypt, they didn't say now let's put teaching of our history into the Egyptians' hands. So I think it's backwards thinking for Black folks to depend on our history being taught by a system we had to fight to even be a part of. And then in states like New Jersey, we're still in hyper segregated districts where you have Black children still being taught by a majority of white people in Black neighborhoods. So I argue that Black history, and this is a call to the church, because when I look at the prophetic tradition, the history responsibility became a communal responsibility and also a religious responsibility. So the Black church, and I so thankful to Dr. Williams highlighting as early as this 1901 with these freedom schools, which are situated in Black churches, which we're trying to reinvigorate that as well here in New Jersey, right? There, in terms of history, that should be taking place within communal efforts, because if we outsource our teaching of our history to our oppressor, that's just foolishness 101.
Okay, I thank you.
I would also like
Go
to
for it.
add
Go for it.
to that we have a King holiday. The schools are closed, but I challenge anyone to tell me what school district requires one of Dr. King's books to be read by its students. So I think if we're going to continue to have the King holiday, we should be approaching our local boards of education and demanding that either some of his books or some of his writings be incorporated into the curriculum. So, because what difference does it make if we close the school if young people don't know the ideals for which he stood? And in terms of where do we go from here, the leadership, I think what we have to do now, we have to have an agenda that fuses, brings together the demands and reforms related to racial justice and racial equality and equity, and fuse them with a program of economic justice, because that's where Dr. King was at the end of his life. And we've basically been in a holding pattern since he was assassinated, or at least since 1972, since the Gary Convention. Some people might even argue, and I'm talking about Black leadership now, that we have gone backwards, that we are demanding less. You know, one of the good things has been recently the demand for reparations, but more people got to come off the sidelines and get in the fight for reparations.
Excellent responses and excellent ways for us to think about interventions into that very question that Linda brought up. There are two more people. I think we have enough time for at least two more comments. One from Terry and the other one, maybe three, because there was someone who anonymously posted Danielle as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
But then there's someone else aside from Danielle. So let's go to Terry. Then I'll ask the question that's in the comment section that doesn't have a name, and then we'll end with you, Danielle.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to say two things really quickly. As a white person, just in working as an anti-racist as much as possible, and working against white Christian nationalism, I never thought deeply enough about something that was said today that brings to mind that part of the idea of that movement is to incite the Black community to violence. And in the process of doing that, to bring worst harm to the community and to our world, period. That never occurred to me. And I think it was Reverend Boyer who helped me to think deeply about that. The other thing is, our spiritual community is really trying to do a lot of anti-racist work. And what we're going to focus on during February is trying to figure out and educate ourselves what are the absolutely most pressing 3 issues happening politically in this new administration. I mean, it's been going on forever, but particularly in this new administration that we need to focus on to put our backs behind it and our votes behind it.
Okay. I think we actually answered one of the questions that was listed anonymously. So if we could, I'd actually like to jump to Danielle.
Okay, thank you, Professor Fisher. So my name is Danielle Jones. I am actually a councilwoman for the borough of Eatontown, located in Monmouth County, New Jersey. I think it's very ironic to be discussing the Amistad Commission because I actually am a commissioner for the Amistad Commission. And I also serve as the council liaison to the Board of Education, both the Eatontown Board of Ed, which serves K through 8, as well as the Monmouth Regional High School Board of Education, which serves Eatontown, Tinton Falls, and Shrewsbury. My question was, and I did put this in the chat, as a currently serving elected official, how can we incorporate some of these principles of Dr. King into legislation and policy, whether it's on the municipal level, or working all the way up to the federal level? I think it's important to incorporate those things because I look at this as a way to dismantle the systems of oppression, but we have to have a multifaceted approach. So what are the things that we could do as elected officials while partnering with our community leaders and organizers and other individuals to create the change that he has been talking about, meaning Dr. King, since the late 50s, early 60s?
I'll take a crack at it. I'll go first.
Go for it.
And I will say that thank you for your question. And I will say one of the things in learning from Dr. King and his approach and is thinking about not engaging in harm reduction, but in thinking about policies that are concerned around transformational change. And one of the approaches, and to thank you for Brother Hamm for bringing it up, is the cost of reparations, right? Dr. King was in support of reparations. You can take a look. I just want to echo the points from Dr. Williams and Brother Hamm about reading Dr. King's work, right? Read Dr. King's work to get a sense of his ideas and his thoughts and to see how visionary he was, how radical he was, and how he was not just engaged in thinking about tinkering around the edges, but fundamentally repairing the wrongs, right? And thinking about building new structures. He called for a radical revolution of values, right? And that streams on down to thinking big, not feeling. And so I would encourage you and your fellow colleagues, elected officials, to not be afraid of the moment, to be bold, right? To think long term and not just short term, in 2 years or 4 years, but to think in 10-year periods, 20-year periods, 30-year periods, and be willing to take a risk for big, bold change.
I want to leave some room for Reverend Boyer to talk here if he wants, because I've had a chance to look at some of the work that you have online. It's really impressive.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I run a church, so I missed the second half of the question.
Just about elected officials and how they can get involved in sort of implementing some of the things that Dr. King stood for, some of the things he advocated.
Yeah, so in terms of elected officials, just super quick, I think we really got to be radical and get our hands around community-led solutions. So I think it's important, right? Like we know issues with policing in the state. Most of what police respond to, so I'm talking about Black communities, right? And even in white communities that are often the most oppressive for Black people driving through. But particularly for Black communities, we need to put public safety back in the community's hands. Most of what the calls that come to police are nonviolent. Put that stuff into community hand. Police, and the safest communities have the least amount of police. If we don't begin to have a radical revolutionary change in values in terms of how we see safety, because for most younger Black men, we don't feel safe with police. So I just want to say that. So really think about that. Also think about how we change economic structures by putting resources into community folks' hands through things like community land banks, community land trusts. How are we protecting historically Black communities economically by keeping property in Black and stop gentrifying areas and continuously pushing people to the margins. Also, Black health needs to be in Black women. Black maternal health needs to be in the hands of Black women, right? We need to stop outsourcing issues for Black communities to majority white institutions to take care of. Let's look at how we move resources to the people most impacted by the issue. That should be the work of lawmakers, is moving resources, technical support, infrastructure building into the hands of the people most impacted by the issues and stop outsourcing to majority white institutions, which just shifts the modality of the structural racism.
Thank you so much.
Can I throw something in?
Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I would just say in terms of our legislators, policymakers, take a look at the appendix of where do we go from here, chaos or community. The appendix is actually a program of legislative and policy reform that Dr. King recommends. I think by reading it, it'll help you, it'll direct you, and you can extrapolate other things from that. Also, I think it's important that legislators and policymakers do whatever is necessary to strengthen civil rights laws. I mean, one of the things that one of the ironies, I'm 71 years old. What can I say after 71 years on the planet is how recalcitrant racism is. I mean, I never imagined that we would have a situation in the 21st century that would be comparable, perhaps in some ways worse than it was in the 1960s. I mean, there are more poor people now than there were when King was alive. You know, racial discrimination still exists. Racial segregation still exists. Racial violence is at an all-time high. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, both the federal and the state, said the greatest threat to domestic safety in the United States is white supremacist domestic terrorism. I mean, imagine. So we need policies and legislation to deal with that. At the state level, there's a police review board bill that New Jersey doesn't have a police review board in the whole state that has subpoena power. Like, we got democratic control of the state government, governor, Senate, and assembly, and we can't get the bill for subpoena power for police review boards out of committee. The reparations bill, we got democratic control, governor, Senate, and assembly in New Jersey. We can't get the reparations bill out of committee. We got government control, democratic control, trifecta control by Democrats, and we can't get a same-day voter registration bill. How come a person can't go in the polls and register and vote on the same day? We got all these computers and everything else, and if someone's not registered, they can't register at the polling place and vote. So those are something. Then lastly, you know, in Dr. King's Economic Bill of Rights, in the 1960s, he was saying we need universal health care. I mean, why do we have this for-profit health system when no other capitalist country has that? We're the only ones. We're the only ones that have medical bankruptcy. So that's something we need. Medicare, take the Medicare system and expand it to the rest of the population.
Thank you so much, Brother Hamm. Okay, so the last person, and thank you for everyone who's given us your time so generously. The last person that I'd love to give a chance, because I jumped over her, and I am so sorry, is Alice Levine.
Hi, thank you very much. I know we're really running out of time, but I was really taken by Professor Williams' statement and thesis that the civil rights movement really started in New Jersey. I don't live in New Jersey now, but I grew up in Englewood during an intense civil rights battle in the 60s. And for some reason, in spite of that, we always learned that civil rights was about the South. So if Dr. Williams could even give one or two examples of, besides what she's already said, of what incidents, what history happened in New Jersey that makes her say this was the root of the civil rights movement, I'd really appreciate it. But I will also read her book.
The traditional civil rights movement, which focused on desegregation of schools, access to public places, King calls civil rights number one, voting rights. What you see happening in New Jersey between early 20th century, 1901 with those freedom schools, through the Hedgepeth-Williams case in 44, is focused on the desegregation of schools and access to public places, which culminate in a new constitution for the state of New Jersey. That becomes the blueprint for the nation. That then becomes what the NAACP is fighting to implement across the nation. And they state explicitly in the NAACP papers that New Jersey is one of our test cases because of the activities that have happened on the ground, such as with the Hedgepeth case. Now, I hope more people read about Hedgepeth and Williams versus the Trenton Board of Education, because it's the precedent-setting case in the nation before Brown. There's a school named after the two mothers, right? But it gets overlooked in the narratives about the civil rights movement for some reason. It should not, but it's a case that happens in 44, a decade before Brown. And it's the only precedent-setting case at the K through 12 level at the state Supreme Court level in the country. And Marion Thompson Wright is working on that case. And the NAACP invites her in 54 and say, we need your research because we're going to take what happened in New Jersey and we're going to apply it to these other cases. So we think about Brown versus Board, right? 54. You got to go through New Jersey to get there.
Yeah, I've been reluctant. One second, I've been reluctant to chime in here because we have such a marvelous panel of speakers. But Dr. Williams is absolutely right, and I think it comes down to the sort of mythology, the mythos that we built around the civil rights movement. And this is, you know, we blame it on the South, and it's much easier to look at what happened, you know, in Little Rock and look at what happened in the South than it is to really focus on the kind of changes that have been happening in New Jersey really since the 1870s. So you're absolutely right. I think it's the easy story to say that the civil rights movement emerged out of the South because the South was worse. But the reality is New Jersey is a far more complicated and compelling story. Reverend Boyer.
Yeah, I was just saying we have some of the Williams from the Hedgepath and Williams in our church.
Again, thank you so much for everyone's time. I'm going to come to you in a second, Linda, because we can't end without you. That's the reality. But I want to make sure that I thank Dr. Williams, Dr. Brutus, Reverend Boyer, and Mr. Hamm. And also thank you for all the work that you do. I can't say that enough. I want to turn it over to Linda to send us off.
Yeah. Thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. A particular thank you to our featured speakers who came with very little urging. Please know how much we appreciate your participation and your collaboration and your ability to seem to always say yes when I ask. Thank you very much for that. So I just want to let those of you who may be new to Sankofa to know that we do publish a weekly newsletter that comes out on Wednesdays. If you are not on our mailing list, please Google Sankofa Collaborative.org. You will find us there and join our weekly mailing list. I also would like to tell you that we have, I think, planned 3 programs in 2025. One will be another virtual program in April. We will have an in-person event at Grounds for Sculpture, I think in July, if I'm not mistaken. And then we will have another event in the fall of the year. So please keep track of us. Again, we've been going on for about 8 years now, and we'd like to continue for at least that many more. The third thing I'd like to say, I'm going to throw in another organization here, that Rutgers, the Newark History Society, the New Jersey History Society, the Daughters of American Revolution, and Rutgers University collaboratively are planning an 8-day event from April 26th until May 4th, commemorating the life of Cujo Benquante, who was an enslaved African who fought in the Revolutionary War, considered himself a patriot, but is also, we know, Newark, probably New Jersey's first documented tax-paying businessman. We are commemorating his life within the context of race relations in the state of New Jersey. It's an 8-day event. 2 days of it is a symposium at Rutgers Newark. You will see some of the people who are on board here because I've already grabbed them. Hopefully Jean-Pierre and Larry Hamm remember, and I'm about to get to the others before we leave today. But please mark your calendars, keep your calendars open. All events will be free and open to the public. They will be held at the Newark Museum, the Newark Public Library, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, all over the city of Newark. But it is a study of African-American life and history within the state of New Jersey since 1725, when Cujo entered. And again, just thank you for your support. We do take financial donations. We are a struggling organization. Those of us who run the Sankofa Collaborative are retirees. And we do this out of our love for people, for our state, and because we just feel that ignorance is a sin and that we should do all that we can do to eradicate ignorance, especially as far as African Americans are concerned. So I think that's it. Sam, is there something else I should be saying? Beverly, Elaine, that I'm forgetting? No. So again, thank you for joining us today. And again, sign up for us, and we will be in touch with all of you.